In the winter of 1918, something came out of the deep water near Port Stephens, Australia, and the men who saw it refused to talk about it for days. These were not wide-eyed tourists or first-time sailors. These were professional crayfish fishermen, men who had spent their entire working lives on the open ocean, who knew every current, every swell pattern, every creature that had any business being in those waters. They knew what a whale looked like. They knew what a shark looked like. They knew what every dangerous thing in the sea looked like, and what they saw that morning did not look like any of them. And what made it worse, what made the silence in the days that followed feel so heavy and so different from the usual silences that follow a hard day on the water, was that these were men who were not easily frightened. Fishermen of that era worked without safety nets, without radio, without the comfort of knowing that someone would come looking for them if they failed to return. Fear was not a luxury they could afford, and yet they were afraid. When they finally came in from the sea, they would not go back out. The fisheries inspector for the region, who had built his career on interviewing men about what they pulled from the ocean and what lived beneath it, sat down with them one by one and listened. And what he heard made him pause. Not because the men were lying, he could tell they were not lying, but because what they were describing, if taken literally, should not exist, could not exist, not according to anything science understood about the ocean at that time, or frankly at any time since. He was a methodical man. He was trained to evaluate evidence. And the evidence sitting across the table from him, in the form of experienced, frightened professional fishermen who all told the same story independently, was not easy to dismiss. The men had been working the deep water grounds near Broughton Island, pulling up their crayfish pots. Heavy, steel-reinforced traps, each one roughly 3.5 feet wide, each one loaded with 2 to 3 dozen large crayfish that had wandered in overnight. These were substantial structures anchored to the seafloor with mooring lines. You do not lose a crayfish pot by accident. They do not simply disappear. Something has to take them. And the taking of a crayfish pot is not the effortless act it might sound like. These are objects built to sit on the seafloor and resist the forces that would move them. And to remove one requires not just strength, but something approaching casual indifference to the weight and resistance of the thing. And something had that indifference. Not for one pot, not for two. Pot after pot after pot vanished into the water. Pots, mooring lines and all, lifted as if they weighed nothing. Taken by something that surfaced beside the boat in a way none of the men could fully process or explain in the moment. What they described was a shark, a ghostly white shark, of almost unbelievable proportions, moving through the water with a kind of effortless, enormous calm, completely unbothered by the presence of the boat or the men watching from its deck. It did not attack the boat. It did not seem interested in the men. It simply moved through the area where the pots were anchored, and where it moved, the pots were gone. When the fisheries inspector pushed them for specifics, for a size, for a measurement, for something concrete he could put in his report, the numbers he got back made his pen stop moving. One fisherman said the creature was 300 feet long. That is nearly the length of an American football field. Another said 115 feet. A third said something in between. The inspector noted carefully that even the most conservative estimate was so far outside the realm of biological possibility for any known species of shark that the rational mind resisted accepting it. And yet the men were unanimous. They had all seen it. They had all watched the water boil and churn as it moved past them. They had all noted the same coloration, that pale, ghostly white that sat wrong against the blue-gray of the ocean around it. They would not go back out to sea, not that day, not for several days afterward. The account was recorded in careful detail by Australian naturalist David Stead, and eventually published in his 1963 book, Sharks and Rays of Australian Seas. In that book, Stead made it clear he was not claiming to know what the creature was. He was recording what credible, experienced men told him, and leaving the question open. He wrote that the lengths given by the fishermen were, on the whole, absurd, too large to be. Taken literally, too consistent to be entirely dismissed. He landed, ultimately, on the position that something remarkable had happened out there near Broughton Island in 1918, and that what it was could not be said with any certainty. That question has remained open ever since. The ocean near the eastern coast of Australia is deep in ways that are difficult to fully imagine from the surface. The water goes down, and then down further into canyon systems and abyssal plains where sunlight has never penetrated and where the pressure is so immense that a human body without protection would be crushed within seconds. For most of human history, we have sent ships across the surface of the ocean and cast nets into its upper layers, and we have convinced ourselves that we have a reasonable understanding of what lies below. The 1918 Port Stephens incident was one of the earliest and most dramatic reminders that this confidence may have been premature, that the ocean was keeping things from us, not through deception, but through sheer scale, sheer depth, sheer inaccessibility. The question those fishermen left behind, what was in the water that day, has never been answered with certainty. Researchers have proposed candidates over the years. A whale shark, some say, though whale sharks do not typically behave in the manner described. And the behavior of swallowing steel crayfish pots and their mooring lines is not something any known whale shark has ever been documented doing. Others point to the possibility of a surviving population of carcharocles, megalodon, the prehistoric mackerel shark that dominated the world's oceans for millions of years before its supposed extinction roughly 3.5 million years ago. The size range described by the Port Stevens fishermen would, in fact, be consistent with megalodon estimates, though mainstream science treats the idea of a living megalodon with significant and well-reasoned skepticism, pointing to the absence of any physical evidence and the creature's dependence on a food supply that would make concealment in deep water essentially impossible. A megalodon needs to eat. Something that large, eating that much, would leave traces. We would know. And yet the deep water keeps producing surprises, not as folklore, not as eyewitness accounts that can be explained away by fear or unfamiliarity or the distortions of memory, as data, as peer-reviewed science, as evidence collected by machines that do not get scared and do not exaggerate, published in academic journals by researchers whose reputations depend on accuracy, funded by institutions whose existence depends on rigorous methodology. The surprises the ocean keeps producing are not the kind that require any relaxation of scientific standards to accept. They are surprising precisely because the science is good. In 2020, a research expedition aboard the Schmidt Ocean Institute's research vessel Falkor was exploring the deep submarine canyons off Western Australia's Ningaloo coast when the remotely operated vehicle Sebastian, descending through the darkness at 625 meters below the surface, encountered something that brought the science team on deck to an immediate and completely speechless halt. Coiling through the water in a vast, slowly turning spiral was a siphonophore, a colonial organism related to jellyfish and corals that appeared to stretch for approximately 150 feet in diameter. Scientists on board estimated that this single animal, if the spiral were uncoiled and stretched into a straight line, would reach somewhere in the region of 45 to 50 meters, possibly longer, possibly the longest animal ever recorded in the history of marine biology. They described it, when they regained the power of speech, as looking like something from science fiction. It was not from science fiction. It was from the deep water off Western Australia. A siphonophore is not what most people picture when they hear the word creature. It does not have a face, it does not have eyes, it does not have a skeleton. What it has is an architecture, a colonial structure in which thousands of tiny individual organisms called zooids clone themselves into specialized forms and attach together in a long, continuous chain, each one performing a different function for the collective. Some zooids swim, some sting and capture prey. Some digest, some reproduce. They share a single long stem, and along that stem runs what researchers believe is a single long axon, a nerve-like fiber that carries signals from one end of the colony to the other, how they coordinate, how they communicate, how a chain of thousands of individual creatures with no central brain manages to move and hunt and function as a unified whole. These are questions that marine biology is still actively working to answer. The footage from that 2020 expedition, shared by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, stunned the scientific community and then quickly escaped into the broader world, spreading through social media and news outlets with the particular velocity that extraordinary footage achieves when it is also undeniably real. The siphonophore moved in a way that seemed almost meditative, slowly rotating in its vast coil, trailing tentacles loaded with neurotoxins that could paralyze anything small enough to drift through them. It had, according to the researchers on board, arranged itself into what they described as a UFO-like feeding posture, hovering in the water column, turning slowly, maximizing the surface area of its tentacles to intercept prey drifting past in the current. It had no idea the ROV was there. It was not performing. It was simply living, in the dark, at depth, as it had presumably been doing for millions of years before any human being ever thought to look. What was most remarkable about that siphonophore was not its size, though the size was extraordinary. What was most remarkable was what it implied about the deep water off Australia, about how much was down there at depth, in the canyons and the dark water between the canyons, living and dying and hunting and reproducing in complete indifference to the human world above. If an animal of that size could exist in those waters without ever having been documented before, what else was down there? That question was taken up with proper scientific seriousness, and the answers, when they began to come in, exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. In 2026, the results of a landmark scientific study were published in the journal Environmental DNA. The study was led by Dr. Georgia Nestor, a molecular ecologist, who conducted the research as a PhD candidate at Curtin University and now works at the Minderoo Oceanomics Center at the University of Western Australia. The expedition itself had taken place aboard the Schmidt Ocean Institute's research vessel, Falkor, in the spring of 2020, the same vessel that had found the giant siphonophore just weeks earlier. And it had targeted the Cape Range and Clotes submarine canyons off the Ningaloo coast, approximately 1,200 kilometers north of Perth. The canyons plunged to depths of more than 4,500 meters. Until this expedition, they had never been scientifically surveyed in any meaningful way. They were, for all practical purposes, unknown. The methodology was something that would have seemed like science fiction to the crayfish fishermen of Port Stevens in 1918. Rather than lowering nets or sending divers into the water, the researchers collected water samples, small bottles of seawater gathered at 5 different depths from the surface down to more than 4,500 meters, nearly 3 miles below the surface. Into each of those water samples, invisibly and unknowingly deposited by every living creature that had passed through in the preceding hours and days, were fragments of genetic material, skin cells, mucus, waste products, the biological signatures of life, environmental DNA. By extracting and analyzing these fragments, comparing them against genetic reference databases and against DNA sequences taken from physical specimens collected by the ROV Sebastian, the researchers were able to reconstruct, with remarkable precision, a portrait of everything living in those canyons. Not what happened to stumble in front of a camera. Not what was large enough and slow enough to be caught in a net. Everything. Every species that had passed through the water column, at every depth, within a time frame of roughly 24 to 48 hours before the sample was collected. The eDNA degrades quickly in marine environments, which is actually an advantage. It means what you are reading is a recent record, not a historical artifact. A single water sample, Dr. Nestor explained, can tell scientists about hundreds of species at once. It can dramatically expand our understanding of deep water environments in ways that simply were not possible with any previous tool. What they found was extraordinary by any standard. 226 species spanning 11 major animal groups. Rare deep-sea fish of several kinds. Cnidarians, the group that includes jellyfish and corals and the great siphonophore that had been filmed in the same waters weeks before. Echinoderms, the group that includes sea urchins and sea cucumbers. Ancient and spiny and moving through the darkness at the bottom of the canyons on tube feet they have used for hundreds of millions of years. Marine mammals, multiple species of squid, and dozens upon dozens of species that had never previously been recorded in Western Australian waters at all. Animals that science knew existed somewhere in the ocean, but had not, until this moment, confirmed were living in this particular part of it. Among the first records were the sleeper shark, a large, slow-moving predator of the deep that had never been confirmed in these waters before, and which scientists had only recently begun to hypothesize might be expanding its range southwestward through the Indian Ocean as water temperatures shift. The faceless cusk eel was there, a remarkable deep-sea fish whose face is so reduced by evolution that it appears to have none, an animal so completely adapted to the lightless abyss that the apparatus of vision has simply been abandoned, given up as an unnecessary expense in an environment where no light ever reaches. The slender snaggletooth, a small but fearsome deep-sea predator with teeth proportionally as formidable as anything in the ocean, was detected in samples from canyons where it had no prior recorded presence. These were not minor additions to a list. They were the kind of range extensions and first detections that reshape the scientific understanding of where these animals live and how widely they range. Deep-diving whales had passed through those canyons too, leaving their invisible signatures in the water column for the scientists to find weeks later. The pygmy sperm whale, a small, shy relative of the ocean's largest toothed predator, present in depths and locations that expanded what was known about its range in these waters. Cuvier's beaked whale, one of the deepest diving mammals ever studied by science, an animal that can plunge to nearly 3 kilometers below the surface on a single breath, and hold that breath for more than 2 hours before returning to the surface, had been through those canyons too, hunting in the darkness at depths that human technology can barely reach, and human biology cannot approach at all. Both of these animals left their genetic signatures in the water at depths and locations where they had not previously been documented. They had been here all along. We just had not known to look. And then there was the giant squid. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, is one of those animals that occupies a peculiar position in the human imagination, somewhere between myth and science. For centuries, sailors reported encounters with enormous tentacled creatures that attacked ships and dragged men into the sea. These stories were dismissed as folklore, as the exaggerations of frightened men in the dark. Then, gradually, specimens began washing ashore, dead ones mostly, occasionally partial carcasses, or the remains of animals pulled up in the stomachs of sperm whales, that had died for them in the deep. The creature was real. It was simply so perfectly adapted to the deep ocean, so supremely built for a world of crushing pressure and absolute darkness, that living specimens were almost never encountered by human beings. The first confirmed photographs of a living giant squid in its natural habitat were not taken until 2004. The first video footage of a living specimen in the deep ocean was not captured until 2012. This is an animal we have known about in some form for centuries, and which we have seen alive in its natural environment fewer times than you can count on your hands. A giant squid can grow to approximately 13 meters in length, longer than a school bus. It can weigh up to 275 kilograms. It has the largest eyes of any animal in the known world, up to 30 centimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a large pizza, an adaptation for detecting the faint bioluminescent glows of prey and predator in the deep-sea darkness. Its tentacles are equipped with suckers ringed with sharp, tooth-like structures capable of gripping with extraordinary force. Sperm whales, the giant squid's primary predator, are routinely found with circular scars on their skin from the sucker teeth of squid that fought back during the attack. These are the marks of a battle fought in absolute darkness, at depths no human being has ever reached without a submarine, between two of the largest predators in the ocean. Before this study, there were only 2 known records of giant squid from Western Australian waters at all, just 2. The most recent confirmed sighting or specimen had been more than 25 years before the expedition. The animals were considered extremely rare in this part of the Indian Ocean, possibly present, but at the very outer edge of their known range, uncommon enough that even encountering their remains was an event significant enough to be recorded and published. The eDNA samples told a different story. Genetic traces of Architeuthis ducks were detected not in one sample, but in 6. Not in one canyon, but in both. The Cape Range Canyon and the Clotes Canyon, separated by geography, but both clearly inhabited by these animals at the time of the expedition. This was not a freak occurrence, not a single animal that had wandered in from elsewhere. The giant squid, in numbers that left multiple traces across multiple sampling locations at significant depths, was living in these canyons. It was at home here. Dr. Lisa Kirkendale, head of aquatic zoology at the Western Australian Museum and curator of mollusks, was direct about the significance of this finding. This was the first record of a giant squid detected off Western Australia's coast using eDNA protocols, and the northernmost confirmed record of the species in the entire eastern Indian Ocean. The range of this animal, already understood to be broad, was now confirmed to extend further and into waters that had not previously been identified as part of its habitat. Lead researcher Dr. Nestor was careful, in the way that good scientists always are, to contextualize this discovery within the larger picture it belonged to. Finding evidence of a giant squid really captures people's imagination, she said, but it is just one part of a much bigger picture. The giant squid was the headline. The story underneath the headline was something even more significant, and in some ways more unsettling. Among the 226 species detected in the study, a large number did not neatly match anything currently recorded in scientific databases. The DNA sequences came up against the reference database and returned partial matches, near matches, or no matches at all. This does not automatically mean new species. There are explanations for such results: incomplete databases, sequencing errors, degraded samples, the natural variation within known species that can produce unusual sequence signatures. But when researchers of this caliber are using this methodology, in waters this poorly studied say that a large number of their samples do not match anything currently recorded, the implication is significant. There are things living in those canyons that science has not yet formally described, things that have been living there, presumably for a very long time, in the dark, unknown. The study's senior author, Associate Professor Zoe Richards from Curtin's School of Molecular and Life Sciences, framed the conservation implications directly. Deep-sea ecosystems, she pointed out, are vast, remote, and expensive to study. Yet they face growing pressure from climate change, fishing, and resource extraction. Environmental DNA gives scientists a scalable, non-invasive way to build baseline knowledge of what lives in these environments, and that baseline knowledge is the foundation of any meaningful conservation effort. You cannot protect what you do not know exists. The sheer number of discoveries, including megafauna, makes it clear that we still have so much to learn about what marine life lives in the Indian Ocean. This is not an abstract concern about creatures that live in a world we will never visit. The submarine canyons off the Ningaloo coast sit adjacent to one of the world's most significant coral reef systems. The deep water and the shallow water are not separate worlds. They are connected by currents, by the movement of organisms between depths, by the biological pump that carries carbon from the surface layers down into the abyss. The creatures that live in those canyons are participants in systems that the entire planet depends on, and we are only just beginning to understand how they function and what role each species plays. The 1918 crayfish fishermen of Port Stevens and the 2026 molecular ecologists of Curtin University are separated by more than a century. The tools they used to encounter the deep ocean could not be more different, but they arrived at the same essential place, standing at the edge of something enormous and mostly unknown, trying to describe what they had found in language that the rest of the world could understand and accept. The fishermen had words for it. They said it was ghostly white. They said it moved through the water like nothing they had ever seen. They said the sea boiled around it. The scientists have sequences of base pairs and peer-reviewed tables and depth-stratified sampling data. Both are trying to say the same thing. There is something down there, more than we knew, more possibly than we can currently imagine. And the fact that we keep being surprised, the fact that every expedition into deep Australian water returns with something science did not expect, is not a sign that our tools are inadequate. It is a sign of how deep the ocean truly is. The deep ocean covers the majority of the Earth's surface. It constitutes the largest habitable space on the planet, home to more life by volume than any other environment on Earth. And we have explored less of it, in meaningful detail, than we have explored the surface of the moon. Every expedition that descends into it returns with something unexpected. Every sample that comes up contains genetic material from things we did not anticipate would be there. Every ROV that enters a submarine canyon finds biological structure, ecological complexity, life organized in ways that challenge our assumptions about what life requires and what it is capable of. The Siphonophore that coiled in the darkness off Ningaloo in 2020 had no awareness that it was being observed. It was not discovered in any sense that it would recognize. It was encountered the way you encounter something that has always been there, living its own life in a world that exists entirely without reference to yours. The giant squid that left its genetic signature in the water column near the Cape Range Canyon had been there before the sampling team arrived and continued to be there after they left. Hunting in the dark water of canyons it has probably inhabited for longer than our species has existed. The sleeper shark moving southwestward through the Indian Ocean is doing so in response to pressures that have nothing to do with human observation. Oceanic temperature shifts, prey availability, the slow reorganization of marine ecosystems under the influence of a warming world. What the 2026 study made clear, in the clearest possible scientific language, is that the deep water off Australia is not empty. It is not even close to empty. It is populated by hundreds of species, including some of the most remarkable animals that evolution has ever produced, living in complete darkness at pressures that would destroy almost any structure a human being has ever built, organized into ecosystems of extraordinary complexity that we do not yet fully understand and have barely begun to document. The tools to understand it are finally being built. The data is beginning to come in, and what it is showing us is an ocean full of life we did not know was there. The fishermen of 1918 knew something was down there. They had no way to prove it. They had no instruments, no methodology, no framework that could translate what they witnessed into something the scientific world would accept. What they had was direct experience. The oldest and least reliable of instruments, but also the most visceral, and a fear that stayed with them long after they came back to shore. They were right, in the most fundamental sense, about the character of the water they were working. It was not known. It was not empty. Whatever they saw or did not see, whatever the truth of that morning near Broughton Island turned out to be, they were right that the ocean was keeping things from them. A century later, science is beginning to see those things clearly. The cameras go down, the water samples come up, the sequences get run, the databases get searched, and the results come back showing 226 species in canyons that had never been surveyed before, including giant squid and deep-diving whales and sharks that no one knew were there. The ocean is speaking in the language of DNA, and what it is saying is, you have barely started. You have no idea how much is here. Come back. Go deeper. Keep looking. The story of Australian deep water is not over. It is, by the measure of what we now know we do not know, barely begun. And every time a vessel puts out from port and heads for the deep canyons off the Ningaloo coast, it is continuing a journey that began, in its own strange way, on a winter morning in 1918, when experienced men who knew the sea better than almost anyone refused to go back out to sea because they had seen something in the water that their understanding of the world had no room for. The ocean had shown them a door. It took science 100 years to build the tools to open it. What is on the other side is still being revealed, species by species, sample by sample, in the deep and silent dark where the light has never reached and the life has never stopped.